Welcome everyone to this Knowledge Rights 21 webinar, providing an ebook update, in particular looking at the examples of where progress is happening, what's going on in Finland and the United Kingdom, two quite sort of contrasting experiences, but I think very illustrative of some of the issues that we're facing. Just to start, as a quick introduction, my name is Stephen Weiber. I am the Director for External Affairs at the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, as well as being heavily involved in the work of Knowledge Rights 21. Knowledge Rights 21, for anyone who is new to our meetings, is a program, it's a campaign developed, bringing together European and international library organizations and independent experts, and working to make sure that the experience, the needs, the priorities of researchers, of learners, of readers, and the librarians that serve them are being heard when there are discussions around information law, policy, and practice. We have a particular focus on ebooks as a topic because I think we argue that ebooks really represent a canary in the coal mine. For those who are not familiar with the term, historically miners would take a canary with them into the coal mine because they knew that if there were to be a carbon monoxide poisoning incident, the canary would die first. So if they saw that the canary fell over, then it was time to get out. We use the term here because ebooks really represent, as far as we see, an example of what happens when you have a deregulation by stealth of content markets, where the protections that allowed libraries to fulfill their missions, to preserve, to provide access to knowledge, to build collections, when those protections can be undermined, can be withdrawn, because instead of dealing with purchasing, we're dealing with licensing. What does that actually mean? And so it also represents an area where there's a real need, we would argue, for action in order to rebalance the playing field to make sure that libraries and their users can continue to benefit from access to knowledge. In terms of broadly where Knowledge Rights 21 focuses around ebooks, crucially, as said, it's around looking to make sure that in a world where ebooks are a key source of knowledge, often the only source of knowledge, where they're also creating exciting new possibilities for access to new, more diverse voices in more accessible formats than previously, that libraries can benefit from all this technological potential, and so of course that their users can benefit from this. We look to do this, we promote the importance of having backstops, of guarantees that make sure that when libraries are talking with rights holders, with vendors, both have an incentive to stay at the table, that there's a way of coming to an agreement that really works, that makes sure that libraries can fulfill these roles. The challenge, what happens if this doesn't work, is that we face the risk of a 21st century black hole, that whereas libraries previously could build those coalitions, now those collections, ebooks are purely held remotely on remote servers, that they can never actually be held by libraries, never permanently in particular, and that we risk like books never de facto entering into the public domain, never actually being there for future generations because we don't have this key public service infrastructure there to collect, to build those connections, to provide access. So this is an illustrative issue, as said, I think, of all of the deeper concerns that there are about a failure to adapt copyright laws, to adapt other laws to the digital age. In order to share some of these examples, I'm very happy to welcome Anna Tuomikoski from the National Library of Finland and Caroline Ball from the University of Derby and the eBook SOS campaign. And they're going to give updates on what's happening at the national level, the discussions, the progress that's been made. Anna Tuomikoski will be able to report back on the first year of the Finnish National eBook platform for public libraries and the experience of trying to build that up, trying to secure access, trying to secure terms, what that's actually been like, what that's meant, and some of the results that we've actually seen. I think this is particularly interesting as there are other countries as well that are also looking at breaking away from using third-party commercial providers and building up their own platforms, their own ways of doing things. And then we'll hear from Caroline Ball, who's played a really leading role in the quite successful eBook SOS campaign that had a lot of success in making ebooks, access to ebooks, eLending into an issue, and provides a really good case study of how you do advocacy around some of these issues. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Anna, first of all. And I should just say, if people do have questions, please do put them either in the Q&A function or in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. So Anna, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. The first task, try to share my my presentation. And let's see if it works.
That's working.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. So my name is Anna Tuomikoski, and I'm working in the Finnish National Library, which hosts the e-library, or has been hosting it for a little bit more than a year now. And I'm going to tell you a little bit what we have learned of this journey. Just to give you very quickly a context for what I'm going to talk to you about, you have some figures here about Finland's population and the public libraries in Finland. So you can see that, you know, as many other Scandinavian countries, you know, people in Finland, they love their libraries, and they are very important in our society. And also, it's important to know that they are mainly financed by municipalities. The state subsidize for a bit, but it's mainly in municipalities' responsibility, and the municipalities are quite independent in Finland in their decisions, especially like in matters of libraries. So this is the kind of background and the context. So what actually has been happening in Finland for years, we have had and audiobooks in public libraries for more than a decade already. But gradually there has been a kind of need for a nationwide solution for that from public libraries. So public libraries have found that it's too difficult for them to handle alone. They already had kind of a lot of cooperation in operating with and audiobooks, but still they thought that it would be best if we had a one big actor there, somebody making this for the whole country. What happened then is that the group of people started to kind of dream big, and they started to try to find the funding for a project to build this kind of service, and they actually got it from the government. In total, we got like 3 million euros and approximately 3 years to do it. And then finally, the result was this nationwide e-library, which was opened in April last year. So what actually were the targets when we started to build this? And these, especially some of these things were very important also for the government. So the mandate was quite strong, especially when we think about people having equal access to digital material, people having equal access to the collection, so that it's not like if you happen to live in a small municipality, you get much less and audiobooks and so on. We wanted to have one platform, and we also wanted to have only one collection, so one collection to everybody. We knew that we wanted to have a platform that would be owned and developed by the library. Or actually, let's say first, we wanted it to be ours, and then we had to choose whether we go for a ready-made solution from the markets or develop it on our own, and we chose to develop it on our own. We also wanted to do this in a cost-effective way. It wasn't really, the real target wasn't really to cut costs, but we knew that when we start to build something like this, there was overlapping work, and we will get rid of that, and that will make it more cost effective. We also knew that running a service like this requires certain skills, and it would be wise that since there's only one organization, we don't need those skills in every library. It's enough that the team running this has those specialties. And we also wanted to have a user-friendly actually platform and app, so that it will be, because before this nationwide solution, we had several services for different content types. So the users had to kind of browse between 5 or 6 different apps, so that when they wanted to use magazines, they were on one app, and Finnish content was on another, and so on. So we wanted to get rid of that. So now we have a nationwide service, and it is run from the National Library, but it is very much run in collaboration with public libraries. We now have a coverage of 97% of inhabitants in Finland, because the municipalities were free to choose whether they want to join this system or they want to provide these services on their own. And the result is that that's most, like 280 municipalities out of about 300 chose to come in. And you can see in the map that the only areas that are not actually covered by us at the moment, they are in the western coast of Finland, and then in the southwest coast. There's a tiny little spot too. This can be explained by the fact that these are mainly Swedish municipalities, or municipalities where Swedish is the language of the majority of the population. And in these municipalities, they think that the amount of Swedish books we have is not enough for their population. And that's completely all right. And we understand it very well. So, but anyway, the coverage is pretty good already. And we now have 3 content providers providing digital books and magazines in several languages on our platform. So we have one content provider who provides books, and audiobooks in Finnish and Swedish. And then we have another for all the other languages for and audiobooks. And the third one is for magazines. So we only buy the contents, and the content flows to our platform. And we have an app which is downloadable in the App Store. You can also download it if you want to look how it looks like. You are able to browse it without registering, but you will not be able to register and to borrow books. Because we use a strong authentication method when you register to check the municipality of residence of that client, to make sure that we can give access to this system. And so we don't have any library cards. You don't need a library card to use our e-library. So it's important to notice that we got the funding for building the service from governments, but now the service is entirely financed by the municipalities. So we don't get any money anymore from the governments. We don't get anything from the National Library either. Everything comes from the municipalities paying 70 cents per inhabitant. The platform and app are open source based. So in case, for instance, some other countries would like to have something similar, we can share. So you can jump in and start co-developing with us. We are a team of 9 based at the National Library of Finland. And as I said, 280 municipalities. At the moment, we have more than 200,000 users, registered users. We have more than 7,000 titles and more than 50,000 licenses. And so the use is limited to residents of participating municipalities. What about the availability of books for us at the moment? There is a lot of variation about how publishers see this service. At the other end, we have publishers who consider this as a threat. I think mainly threat to their commercial services, since the coverage of streaming services for books is very high in Finland at the moment. Maybe another threat is that publishers are afraid that having an e-library will affect the amount of printed or physical books libraries buy. because they are very dependent on the business model with physical books. So they don't want to see any decline in that. Public libraries are really big buyers of physical books in Finland. And at the other end, we have these publishers who see this as an extra distribution channel, bringing in extra money. So you have everything, these ends and everything in between, actually. So those who consider it as a threat, they limit the number of titles they offer, and they might use special pricing models, which are difficult to us, which are more comparable with streaming services business model. And they also may set the price so high that we are not able to purchase their books. And at the other end, those considering it as an extra distribution channel open the whole catalog mainly, and we are free to choose. I think that the main issue here is to ask, even though the availability for us is better now than it used to be before this nationwide solution, I think the main question we should ask is who is really curating this collection? In my opinion, it's mainly publishers. It's not the library that is able to create its own collection. And that is the problem. Then, of course, you could ask, why go digital? Why don't you just stick on physical books? But I think it's hugely important that we follow the consuming habits that when consumers want to use more and more digital books, we also have to be there to maintain the relevance of public libraries, and also to make sure, especially to make sure that digital content is accessible also, without a fee. In my opinion, we as a society have kind of committed to offering information and access to literature to everybody. And at the moment, this is being challenged. We already in Finland, where the streaming services for books are really strong, we already see that not every book is published as a physical book anymore. Will these books be always unavailable for library, or what happens? We also see that we can reach new audiences with digital books. We can see that, for instance, people with lower education use more audiobooks than what they do with physical books. And I think that's very important, that we keep everybody on board. And we need to guarantee access to not only to literature in general, but also to education, to lifelong learning, and so on, also in the digital world. So what are the challenges if you start building something like we have built? I think that the first one is that you have to have the courage to separate the content and the platform. And that means that you, in some way or another, you acquire the platform for yourself, so that you don't have to buy them in a package. So you don't have to buy the books with the platform. I also see that in many countries it's very difficult to switch from local collections to a nationwide, but the bigger you are, the more you have power, and the more you get bargaining power too. This kind of service is never ready. So if you strive for something perfect, you will never get it done. So you just have to have the courage to put something out and accept that you get feedback. And there's always somebody who thinks that it should have been more ready before you launch. It's very important, if you do it for public libraries, to do it with public libraries. I'll have some other words about this later. And also, when you start building a digital collection with the platform, you will need a lot of different skills that you normally need in library world. You will need ICT skills, you will need people who understand the business models with publishers and so on. In our case, the success factors, in my opinion, there were several. And maybe the first one was that it came from bottom to top. So the need came from the public libraries. And the initiative to find the funding came from public libraries. Especially in case of national libraries, it's a bit dangerous to start from the top to bottom. I mean, there is a risk that public libraries don't come on board. We have a very long tradition of collaboration within libraries, and that helped us a lot. They have for decades collaborated in different ways, in unofficial ways, and so on. So it was easy to continue that. It was important that there were some people who had the courage to really to dream big and don't stick in a tiny little solution. And we had organizations and people who were lobbying to make it through. I have to give a special thanks to the Library Association in Finland. They did a lot to get the money. The funding from the government was essential. I mean, you have to get some money for the project phase. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult. And then you have to have some resilience so that you can cope with different. There will always be different opinions. There are librarians who think that we shouldn't have done this, or we should have done it in a different way. There are stakeholders who say that. There are patrons. At the moment, we know that, for instance, people living in Helsinki, the collection is smaller for them at the moment than it used to be before us. So we just have to have the resilience to cope with that, and because we know that in the long run, this is better. So I try to give you some takeaways. First, don't aim for harmony, because if you start doing something like this, there will always be friction. You have different opinions, but actually, if you want to get something done, the best area is somewhere between conflict and harmony. It's not in the harmony. The second is with special regards to my friends in Sweden, avoid analysis paralysis. So I mean that if you just go on planning and planning, or discussing and discussing, you will never get it done. It's also very good if you have courage to experiment, and if you can keep up with the mode, thinking that it's the goal is to learn and not necessarily to succeed with everything, so that if you fail, it doesn't matter. And then also, this is related to the second point, that if you just keep on planning, you can't get it done, and you get better results if you just are ready to find practical solutions to problems that come up, instead of planning everything beforehand. Thank you, and feel free to ask.
Thank you so much. So there are a couple of questions for clarification in the chat, and I don't know if you. So the first one is, what does the 50,000 licenses mean when there are only 7,000 titles? And the second one is with the 70 cents per person cost. Is that for the whole cost, so platform and licensing costs?
Yeah. Okay. So the 50,000 licenses means that for each title we have more than one license, because we mainly operate with a one copy, one user model. So if I want that two persons can read the ebook at the same time, I need two licenses. So that's the explanation for that. And 70 cents, yes, it covers everything. Our salaries, all the IT development at the moment, not the building, but at the moment, all content acquisitions and everything.
Excellent. And then actually, it was a question I was interested in that I could see that Ben's put down as well on that questions about licenses, and Ben's question focuses on possibilities for access for Finnish speakers abroad, and obviously there are a lot in Sweden, there are a lot in other countries, but
Yeah, but we can't, because the whole system is based that you
the
have
licenses
residence
are
of,
there.
no, but that you have a residence of your municipality, you are living in Finland.
Well, and I guess the municipalities only want to pay for people
Yes, I
who
mean, that's
actually
very
live
easy to explain why. Of course, there are Finns living abroad and they would be interested, but they don't pay their taxes to Finland. So it's easy to say that no free lunches, sorry.
and the other interesting question was around that access to international content, because I know in other countries like Estonia, they've split. So there's one platform for the Estonian titles and one platform for international, and they tend to go out to a third party on that. But being able to integrate everything into one place.
That was the purpose from the very beginning, that all content types will be on the same platform. So
But
all
it,
languages also, we have material in Finnish, Swedish, English, French, German, Spanish, Russian, Ukrainian, Sami
oh wow.
language, and we are counting to have something in Estonian and
Mm.
Italian.
And can you say anything about that experience of trying to access the international content? I know that, for example, we do hear stories of American publishers being unwilling to allow licensing of things for eLending
I
outside of the
think we
US
have
at
the same
least.
problems. I mean, it's not the question of the content or the aggregator there. I mean, that the response is same for all aggregators. So that if there's the publisher, like let's say American publisher, that doesn't want to sell to libraries, they don't sell to any organization who is in between them and the libraries. So I mean, if it's not in Overdrive, it's not in our system either, even though we are not working with Overdrive for foreign content.
No, no, it's a standard problem, and I think I know
Yeah.
you made the point. Obviously, that there's the equity point. I think that point about the, I don't know, libraries as an example of the social contract, this idea that we will invest in this idea that everyone should be able to access everything in some way. And actually the risk that there is when effectively you're allowing a third party to run your collections policy. I don't know, we've put out a little bit of work that just underlines to what extent library laws are systematic in saying libraries should be able to build up their collections freely in response to the needs of their users. And at no point does it say to be convenient or in order to suit the business models being pursued by others. I can also see I can see that Maciej. I was actually going to mention Maciej's work. So Maciej Legojinski, who's based in Oslo and who's doing a PhD and has done some really interesting work around the culture and the process of developing ebook models and platforms that offer some fantastic insights into the character of different Nordic countries
Definitely. If you
as
want
well
to
in
know
terms of
something
yeah.
about Nordic countries, e-lending systems, please Google his
Yeah,
master's thesis. It
yeah,
is
sort of
excellent work.
centralization in Denmark, more decentralized in Sweden, more careful in Norway. But I'm tempted to invite Maciej to a webinar at some point as well to talk about that. But um, we're up to the half hour, so I'm now going to say thank you, and I'm going to
Thank
hand
you.
over to Caroline to present a little bit, and then we'll have some immediate sort of responses, questions to Caroline, but then open up a little bit. So please do keep putting your questions in the chat. So Caroline, over to you.
Fantastic, thank you, and thank you, Anna, for that presentation. It was really interesting, and you know, some of the things you were kind of saying, you know, some points that I'll probably touch on or elaborate on in my presentation. So for those who sort of don't know me or haven't come across me before, my name is Caroline Ball, and I'm one of the organisers of the eBook SOS campaign, which is a UK-based, very much kind of grassroots campaign to try and fix the broken ebook market. which, you know, as we've just kind of seen, is not exclusively broken in the UK. The issues that we face in the UK are, you know, in many ways very, very similar to issues that are being faced in Finland, that are being faced across Europe, in the United States, and really globally. And we are talking about kind of global solutions in many ways, but obviously there are always going to be regional differences in how those solutions kind of manifest, the advocacy efforts that go into sort of trying to achieve those solutions. And so what I'm going to talk about a little bit is kind of what's been happening in the UK lately, you know, what we've been trying to kind of push for, where we've been having a few successes, and where we still face some of those barriers and those challenges, and some of those, you know, Anna articulated really well. You know, my focus has been quite sort of heavily on the academic library sector, which obviously does have kind of different imperatives and different challenges, but again, there is that kind of common thread really of sort of outsourcing our collections, outsourcing our curation abilities, outsourcing that sort of right to be able to determine what we have access to, and what, you know, what is in our libraries. And that really is at the kind of heart of a lot of the issues around digital content in general, not just ebooks. So, you know, I think most of these issues, you know, I don't need to go into too much detail about, because I'm you know, sort of taking an educated guess that most of the people on this call are probably more than familiar with these kind of issues, have probably run into them, both on a kind of individual level and on a sort of institutional and national level. So, you know, you don't really need me to go into a lot of the detail about, you know, the struggles that we have with ebooks. But it, you know, it really is worth kind of reinforcing that the ebooks are kind of critical in the modern era. You know, not only do our users expect us to make content available digitally, but the way that, you know, the worlds of education, the way the worlds of work and knowledge and research and entertainment and leisure work these days, you know, digital really is kind of taken for granted. It is the kind of default option for a lot of people, and it does facilitate a lot more in that it is, you know, remote, it is accessible from anywhere. It doesn't rely on kind of physical, you know, bricks and mortar or physical items. And so that expectation that the ebooks should be available, it is really, really sort of ground in, I think, to people's expectations, and it's partly those expectations that are one of those barriers that we do have to work against. You know, and libraries are really an essential part of delivering that, you know, to our users, whether that is students, whether it is sort of individuals accessing public libraries, whether it is lawyers or doctors. You know, libraries really are at the core of that, because they have the capacity to, you know, make available and provide so much more than any one individual could possibly, you know, purchase or access themselves. But obviously there are huge barriers. Some of those are market barriers, some of those are legal barriers, but they are actively preventing libraries from fulfilling that kind of core mission and fulfilling that role that people do expect of them. You know, that they are a source of wide varieties of information in a wide variety of formats, and that it is freely available. And that is what people expect of libraries. But because of the way the digital market works, we really can't fulfill that role. You know, costs, as we all know, are excessive. You know, Anna touched on that as well. You know, licensing terms are often incredibly restrictive. And sometimes, you know, we just can't buy things. And I say buy in the, you know, the loosest of terms, because we aren't really buying them to begin with. But sometimes, you know, we just literally cannot get material. Publishers will not license books to libraries. You know, it might be individual titles, it might be entire publishers. So there are these kind of barriers. And, you know, fixing it is not just a budget issue. And I think that is one of the barriers that we do run into quite a lot of the time. Obviously, the issues around, you know, high prices does tend to get the headlines. It is often what we tend to lead with when it comes to kind of advocacy, and when it comes to talking to policymakers or to kind of influential people in sector organizations or in our own institutions. You know, those kind of high prices are what gets people's attention, but it isn't just an issue of not having enough money or things being too expensive. It really is about that issue of kind of public access to knowledge, public access to learning, public access to, you know, our own cultural memory. And that really is a sort of key knowledge equity issue. And I think boiling it down to that kind of budgets and money really does the whole issue a disservice. And I think in our advocacy efforts, we really need to make it clearer that it is an issue of equity, that it is an issue of access, that we're not just complaining because stuff's expensive and our budgets aren't very big anymore. You know, so we're kind of facing a really sort of multifaceted challenge, I think, here, and expectations and misunderstandings are one of those big kind of challenges. So, you know, the evidence that we do have to be able to kind of make these arguments is pretty striking, though, and it is pretty stark. You know, CILIP and Knowledge Rights 21 recently have been working together on a project to bring together evidence that we can use when talking to, you know, policymakers, when talking to politicians, when talking to, you know, CEOs and you know, vice chancellors and organizations. And we've produced a kind of literature review and a case for support that really does sort of put in quite clear terms the scale of the problem and some of the issues. And, you know, yes, it does kind of lead with prices. As I said, that is the kind of headline grabber. But it does also talk about things like licensing models and the way that the licenses quite often block some of those kind of key, you know, fundamental library functions, things that we expect libraries to be able to do, things that in many cases, you know, libraries do have a right or a guarantee to do when it comes to kind of print content. So things like being able to lend books, you know, preserve items, functions like interlibrary loan, you know, all of those are enshrined within legislation, but only when it comes to those kind of print materials and those print collections. When it comes to digital, because of the kind of licenses, because we don't own anything, because we are bound by terms and conditions and contracts, they you know, actively prevent us from exercising some of those rights that do exist within legislation. And that, again, is another kind of key message to be sending to sort of policymakers, that we are not asking for more than we already have a right to do. We are just asking to extend that into the digital sphere. And obviously, you know, like we've talked about, you know, key content sometimes is not available at all. You know, either it is available in a digital form, but not for libraries, only for individuals. Sometimes, you know, we have it and then it's gone again. And we've seen that most recently with things like the Clarivate announcement, where, you know, they are no longer going to be selling to libraries at all. You know, if librarians kind of work closely in their kind of acquisitions departments, they may have, you know, be quite familiar with, you know, the process of kind of bundling or packages, where you might subscribe to a large collection, but usually as kind of part of the licensing terms, those collections do get updated on a regular basis, and so that can mean that the content that you might be relying on suddenly is removed with very little warning sometimes. So that ability to create our own collections that we've been kind of talking about, not just in terms of what we can access, but even how long we can have access to it for, and the ability to guarantee that kind of continuity of access is being undermined as well. In the CILIP and Knowledge Rights 21 case for support and literature review, we've made a point of drawing on examples from the NHS as well, because obviously, you know, we talk a lot about kind of public libraries and academic libraries. Certainly in the UK, NHS libraries, you know, don't tend to shout about this issue quite as much, and because, you know, they're in quite a sort of delicate political position, I think, with being so dependent on the government, obviously, for their funding. But it is, you know, critical in the most kind of critical sense when it comes to things like NHS libraries and health libraries, where you have these libraries really unable to provide key medical texts to, you know, surgeons and doctors. And, you know, I don't need to explain the implications of, you know, our health teams and our health organizations not being able to access key up-to-date kind of critical research. And the prices that they pay are every bit as kind of extortionate in many respects. And they face, you know, the same budget restrictions. We've heard examples of doctors, you know, turning to piracy, turning to pirate sites, turning to Reddit to get kind of bootleg versions of sort of critical medical textbooks because their NHS library, you know, can't provide it, doesn't have the money to buy the title, or did have access and it was withdrawn. And that really has kind of hugely important implications for patient care. You know, it's not just a case of, oh, this is a nice title to have, but we haven't got the money. You know, this is kind of key information that our doctors and our surgeons are not being able to access. You know, there's a few kind of examples here. The report has far more than this. I just wanted to kind of surface a few kind of key examples, and these are the kinds of things that we've been using with policymakers to try and get across the scale of the issue. You know, I'll talk a little bit later about the challenge of misconceptions being, I think, one of the biggest barriers and hurdles to face when we are talking about kind of advocacy efforts. Even within, you know, higher education, where you would think academics would be a bit more familiar with these issues, we still run into, you know, assumptions about the price of ebooks, assumptions that libraries kind of pay the same that individuals do, which obviously when it comes to print books, you know, we do largely. In fact, sometimes, you know, with print books, because we are buying in such bulk and buying through registered book suppliers, we often get them cheaper than an individual might pay in a, you know, a high street bookshop. So there is that assumption that when it comes to ebooks, it's the same. You know, I myself have often had academics emailing me and saying, oh, can we get this ebook? It's only, you know, 40, 50 pounds on the publisher's website. And I'm like, no, it's only 40 or 50 pounds for you to buy. You know, if the library were to buy it, it's probably, you know, 400, 500, 4,000, 5,000. And so that kind of disconnect between, you know, what things actually cost and what people assume that they cost is a big challenge. Digital also means that people tend to assume that it is more accessible, it is more open. You know, people assume that with an ebook, naturally everybody can access it because it's digital, it's not a physical item. For, you know, what do you mean only one person at a time can access it? You know, that artificial kind of scarcity that's built in is something that people don't understand, don't realize. And so that's another kind of misconception that we have to kind of overcome. And again, you know, I talked earlier about, you know, buying ebooks. People don't realize that we don't own them. They don't realize that we are kind of licensing access. You know, we are renting access effectively. And as with a lot of kind of rental agreements or you know, streaming services, things get removed. You know, I myself have a Netflix subscription. And every month I get kind of emails saying, you know, watch this now, this content's leaving at the end of the month. And that, you know, we kind of take that for granted with streaming services. That's just kind of the way they work. Things aren't always available all the time. But libraries can't operate that way. You know, an academic library or a health library can't operate on the assumption that, yes, we've got this stuff now, but oh, it's probably going to go at the end of the month. And yeah, I know you really, really need that book on, you know, identifying skin diseases, but sorry, it's going to go. You know, we can't operate that way. And the quote I've got on the screen here, this is taken from the literature review, the Unlocking eBooks Project literature review. But I think it really is a key kind of message to get across. This is not a luxury. This is not it's nice to have this in this digital format. You know, it's essential these days. You know, access to this content is essential, not just for academic success and inquiry, but for research, for health, for learning, for knowledge, to have, you know, informed citizens. And we are being actively sort of inhibited from providing that essential item. So this is sort of some of the things that's been happening lately. As I said, the Unlocking eBooks project that ebook SOS has been involved with alongside, you know, CILIP and Knowledge Rights 21, which has been funding it, launched the sort of case for support and a full kind of literature review, which really provided for the first time in one place a really kind of solid sort of evidence base for making these arguments to policymakers. You know, we'd been kind of bringing together a lot of information previously. We've been, you know, crowdsourcing examples of sort of very high prices, of price changes, of, you know, content that we had access to and then was removed. We've been kind of pushing for support. But this was really the first time that we kind of brought that together in a sort of really sort of formal kind of policy-based sort of format that I think policymakers really kind of expect. And we then have been using that to try and begin conversations with MPs, with kind of policymakers and influencers. We had a meeting at the House of Lords in February, which was a really great opportunity to kind of get that initial foot in the door and get some parliamentary interest. And that was in February, and that involved, you know, quite a few sort of representatives from library organisations across the UK. So I was there representing eBook SOS. Ben White was there representing Knowledge Rights 21. You know, we had representatives from sort of Sconnell, from CILIP, from NHS libraries, from you know, sort of Libraries Connected, public libraries. And we had the opportunity to talk for the first time to you know, MPs and some of the Lords as well. And for many of them, this was the first time they'd heard of this issue. This was the first time it had really come up to their radar. And they were quite shocked, to be honest. You know, the feedback that we were kind of getting was that they were really shocked by the prices, particularly by the kind of restrictions that were in place. Like a lot of people, they had very kind of similar assumptions about kind of how eBooks worked, and, you know, probably quite naturally assumed that eBooks work in the way that print books work. You know, you kind of think, well, why wouldn't they? It's the same thing in a digital format. And so getting the opportunity to really make it clear to policymakers that it really is a completely different market because of this digital nature, because it is sort of licensed rather than owned and purchased, and therefore all of the rights that individuals and libraries have with physical items just don't apply. So they were really quite shocked, but it also, I think, having that opportunity to talk to them really made clear, I think, the scale of the challenge that we face when sort of doing this kind of advocacy activity, because it is incredibly complicated to try and explain this issue to people who, you know, have no knowledge of how, you know, libraries operate, how they buy books, the various kind of book suppliers and publishers and vendors that we deal with, the way that ebooks are sold to libraries, the different platforms that we have to use, you know, the differences in terms of kind of license agreements and how they function, the way different publishers have different models. It was incredibly complicated to try and get across this issue. And I think that is one of the challenges that we have been facing. And I think we need to find ways to try and boil it down more and to try and make it a simpler issue, and to really kind of condense it to the heart of the issue, which is around that issue of not being able to create our own collections, not being able to manage our own collections, not being able to provide the material that our users and our supply and our vendors and our customers kind of want to get from us, that you know, libraries are effectively trying to operate with their hands tied behind their back. And it is an incredibly complicated sort of issue to try and explain. And that is, you know, one of the big barriers. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit because my next slide actually talks about some of these barriers, but you know, I did sort of want to touch on some of the things that are in the report, the Unlocking eBook SOS report, because what we are asking for is not outrageous. It's not asking for the earth. It's not asking for, like I said earlier, more really than we are already allowed to do when it comes to print content. We are effectively just asking for the same rights and the same opportunities and the same guarantees that already exist in legislation for libraries. you know, there is already legislation that recognises that libraries are a public good, that libraries ought to be able to make material available to the public, that libraries ought to be able to preserve content, to curate it, to make sure that, you know, material is sort of saved for future generations, that libraries are able to lend material, that libraries are able to purchase material. All of this exists in legislation already. It just doesn't exist for digital content. So the case for support and the literature review really sort of lays out these recommendations in terms of things like fair pricing. Again, you know, we all acknowledge publishers have a right to make money. They have a right to make a profit. They have a right to you know, practice their business model. But it is extortionate. You know, the prices that they are asking are outrageous in many cases. And just as, you know, there are all kinds of mechanisms in sort of consumer and competition law to balance the rights of the consumer against the rights of, you know, kind of any business, that ought to exist for ebooks as well. You know, there are mechanisms to make sure that consumers are not being ripped off, that businesses are not taking advantage of their sort of position, their size, their monopoly position to charge whatever they want. You know, those mechanisms exist. We are asking them to be applied to libraries. We are asking for fair pricing. You know, we recognise that digital does mean that you can make it available to more people, that digital access in libraries does potentially mean that, you know, people are not always going to go and purchase items themselves. I think that the counter argument that a lot of librarians would make is that, you know, many people rely on libraries because they cannot afford to buy those items themselves and therefore wouldn't have gone and bought it, regardless of whether the library made it available or not. But, you know, we are recognising that, you know, libraries buying items may have an impact on publisher, you know, markets. So we're not saying, you know, they have to charge us exactly the same as the print. But we are saying that that pricing should be fair, that it shouldn't be outrageous. We are asking that things are made individually available rather than only as part of packages or bundles. And that, you know, this recognition that just as libraries should be allowed to, are allowed to loan print items, they should be allowed to loan e-items as well. So again, none of this is outrageous, none of this is radical, none of this is anything that libraries are not already doing. It is purely about, you know, making sure that that extends into the digital sphere, and recognizing the kind of different infrastructure and the different sort of legal system that we sit in when it comes to digital content, particularly around kind of contracts, and having provision again to make sure that those contracts are fair, that we aren't kind of being forced into signing unfair terms and conditions purely because, as in the case of some examples like law libraries and health libraries, they have to have this content. You know, with public libraries, it's not quite so kind of critical in the sense that, you know, lives don't necessarily rest on access to that material. A lot of it is more about kind of personal reading, leisure reading than, you know, I must have access to the up-to-date research. I must have access to the, you know, the legal practitioner text. So I know what the law says. I have to have access to the most up-to-date medical material. And in those instances, again, that kind of public need, that sort of public benefit should be weighted against that kind of private profit or kind of business market benefit. And at the moment, it is very heavily tipped in the other direction because we haven't been able to get that kind of governmental or sort of market intervention. So I have, you know, sort of touched on most of these kind of issues and barriers anyway, but I think they kind of do bear repeating to a certain extent, that this is a very complicated issue. It isn't just purely about kind of libraries in many senses. It really does veer into issues around copyright law, around competition law. In many cases, what we're talking about from a library perspective also in many respects kind of overlaps with kind of consumer law. You know, individually, we don't own the books that we buy on Kindle or the music that we buy through iTunes. And many people on an individual level don't realize that. You know, I was complaining the other day about being on Amazon, on the Amazon Prime movie site, and they had options for kind of buy or rent. And I was kind of sitting there thinking, well, they're both rental, actually. You know, it's just the amount of time I have access to it for. I can rent it for 48 hours or I can buy it indefinitely, but actually they're both rental. They're both, you know, licensing access. I don't actually own the version that says buy. And I know that, you know, some parts of the world, I think in America, they have had legislation that actually is starting to require businesses to make that a little bit clearer, to start removing things like buy and purchase kind of wording, because it is contributing to this misconception, I think, around kind of digital access and digital content, that we don't own it. And because, you know, those principles of ownership don't apply, there's, you know, then all that kind of knock-on effect under legislation around, you know, the first sale doctrine or the principle of exhaustion, you know, the rights that you have when it comes to ownership don't apply to a lot of digital content because you don't own it, but people don't realize that. And that is very, very complicated to try and explain. You are touching on all kinds of areas of consumer law and competition law and copyright law, and it does tie into why this is such a challenging issue to try and get kind of, you know, legislative attention for. And that is one of the kind of major barriers, and, you know, one of the reasons why the eBook SOS campaign kind of came about, and why we've been working with CILIP and Knowledge Rights 21 is to partly simplify the issue, you know, boil it down to its kind of most critical parts, and kind of, you know, surface it and give it that kind of visibility, and really make it clear that it is inhibiting libraries from performing that core function, that it's not just, oh, we don't like having to pay lots of money when the budgets are really tight at the moment, but it's, you know, we cannot provide information that our users need, and those users are not just people going to their public library, but they are lawyers, and they are doctors, and they are, you know, businessmen, and they are the future researchers and academics. And, you know, what does it say for us as a society if people don't have access to the knowledge they need? And that really is at the heart of the issue, I think. So the next kind of stages are sort of building on a lot of this kind of advocacy work we've been doing. We are trying to make connections with interested MPs, either that have been kind of, you know, reaching out after the roundtable at the House of Lords. We've been encouraging people to write directly to their MPs, and we've had some traction with some of them coming back to us. We are looking to kind of make connections, and we've been offering briefings to sort of, you know, government departments, individual MPs, you know, offering to meet with them on an individual basis, or sort of, you know, on a more collective basis to try and get across kind of the critical elements of what we're talking about here, that it isn't just oh, libraries are having a bit of a problem, that it really does underpin, you know, a lot of what governments are trying to build on for the future in terms of research, in terms of education, in terms of the NHS. You know, information underpins everything in society, and if you can't guarantee that, that's a problem for everyone, particularly, I think, lawmakers. So we're really trying to kind of step up a phase in terms of our advocacy, and moving from that kind of grassroots, you know, trying to raise awareness kind of across the board to more sort of targeted approaches to those MPs, to those kind of, you know, particular organisations and particular sectors, and also learning from international examples. And I think this is something that's really, really key when talking about ebooks, because, you know, as I said at the start, this is a global issue. We are all facing the same challenges. In many respects, it's probably the same publishers, because these are such global organizations now. I think particularly in the academic world, you know, you boil it down, there's about 5 of them when you trace imprints back and back and back. So we are dealing with the same challenges. And so, you know, what we can learn from colleagues in other countries, what we can learn from sort of legislative efforts in other countries, I think is really beneficial, because it gives us examples of you know, what has been tried elsewhere, what is being currently done elsewhere. In America, for example, most recently in Connecticut, you know, they've been bringing in legislation which has been quite interesting, in the sense that it sort of targeted the libraries rather than the publishers. They tried targeting the publishers before, and that kind of never got it through the courts. So now they're basically saying libraries cannot sign these unfair contracts. They can't stop publishers from offering unfair contracts, but they can say, well, the libraries aren't going to be allowed to sign them. So there are kind of different ways of approaching things that I think are interesting as well, that we can draw on when talking about this issue with policymakers, because this is the benefit, I think, of the ebook issue, if there is any benefits, is that it's not just a regional thing. It's not just something happening in isolated little pockets. It is happening everywhere. And so there are examples of work going on across the world that we can point to and say, well, they're doing this in Finland, and they're doing this in France, and they're doing this in America. If they're doing something about it, maybe we should look at doing something about it as well. And here are some examples. Because this really is a collective effort, I think, and that's again one of the key kind of messages to get across. We need to keep the pressure on. We need to keep using kind of clear, consistent advocacy messages to try and make it as simple and understandable as possible. Because we understand these problems only too well, but we are talking to people who have absolutely no idea of the complexities of these issues, and no idea certainly about all the ins and outs of licenses and terms and contracts and competition law and consumer law. So, it really is, a kind of ebook SOS 101 that we have to kind of boil it down to. So it is about that kind of clear messaging. And I think as with advocacy in any kind of field, and not just the library world or the information world, it's about individual people doing what they can. I think a lot of the time when it comes to any issue, particularly in sort of social justice terms, people often think, what can I do? I'm only one person. But it is that collective activity that really, shapes messages and brings the impetus and for sort of change. So it is about individual people, writing to their own representatives, writing to their own MPs, trying to, conversation by conversation with people in your own organizations or your own institutions, raising the issue wherever you can, sort of keeping that pressure up. Because we've had MPs get in touch with us after someone wrote to them, wanting more information, wanting evidence that they can use so that they can start talking to their colleagues. So it does pay off. And that is one of the reasons why CILIP and Knowledge Rights 21 launched this sort of Unlocking eBooks project, to be able to provide documentation and resources and evidence that individuals could use in conversations with their representatives. So anything individuals can do. I think the ebook SOS campaign alone shows what you can achieve if you don't just sit back and leave it to big organizations. If you do kind of say, I'm mad as hell and I want to do something about this. So that's really the kind of mentality that we've been trying to encourage as well. Don't sit back and leave it to CILIP or Knowledge Rights 21 or SCONL or JISC or your institution. Step up and try and start making the case yourself. And there is support there. There is support within the UK. There is support internationally. So kind of draw on those resources, draw on the material, draw on the experience of what people have been doing already. Because it is that kind of drip-fed pressure that results in most kind of true critical change. It very rarely comes from the top down, from governments. It is, the imperative being forced on governments by individuals and by that public pressure. So that is really kind of what we're driving towards with the campaign, on an individual level and a collective level. This is kind of really the core of the message, I think, that we're trying to get across, and also that libraries just need to be able to do digitally what they've always done physically. That itself is a really kind of key core component that I think needs to be kind of kept in the sort of mind when having these conversations, and reinforcing to people, this is not outrageous what we're asking for. We're not asking for the earth. We're not, we're not being radical. We're not trying to overturn publishing and make it all free and not allow them any profit and dictate how they operate. We're just asking for the rights that libraries have in the physical sphere to also extend to the digital sphere. But to do that, we need legislative change. And that really is the sort of simplest message, I think. So thank you very much for kind of listening. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I can see that there's been kind of things popping up in the chat, but I haven't actually looked at any of them yet. So I'm happy to take any questions if they do pop up.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And just to echo the point about, please do put comments in the chat. But I think, you know, there's obviously so much that comes out from that. I think the absurdity of the idea that those sort of fundamental roles of libraries around providing access, supporting preservation, supporting research, that somehow those don't count in the digital world is absolutely insane. And I know that sometimes there will be the argument that, well, it's okay, we can license that now. But I don't know, licensing predates digital, and we didn't license preservation in the past, so why the hell should we be licensing preservation or anything else now? And I think, I know you also made some really good points about, you know, I feel like it's one of the challenges we have is that, I don't know, there are certain types of legal tools that move in one direction or the other direction and are not particularly flexible. I know that, you know, there's the argument around copyright, and I find that's always slightly frustrating because the logic of copyright says that you need to go for balance at all costs. Whereas actually, you know, if you're a doctor who needs the latest text to do things, like, it's probably not, balance is not your number one concern there, and so you end up sort of stuck in one thing. I think, Edna, you've made the point, which I feel it's such a strong one, about this. Effectively, there's been a deregulation by stealth, that without anyone noticing outside of libraries, there's just been this undermining bit by bit of this role of libraries that means that we're leaving things to the market. And so, of course, if your definition of success is profit maximization, I don't know, setting the highest price that the market will bear, then maybe markets are working very well. But if you leave all of the decision-making power in the hands of the vendor or the right holder, they have no incentive to take account of the costs of non-access. There's no, it's a negative externality.
It is, and I think it also, you know, I mean, part of it, I think, is the whole like laissez-faire economics and sort of, you know, neoliberal capitalism that sort of dominated in terms of government, I think, over the last kind of 20, 30 years. But, you know, it kind of comes back to that point that, you know, government is supposed to be there to represent, you know, the interests of the people. And, you know, if there are instances where, you know, the market is taking advantage or is, you know, actively undermining, you know, services that are considered to be, you know, of public benefit, or, you know, a public good, or a core part of, you know, maintaining democracy, then that is partly what government is there for. You know, there is a reason why we have consumer protection law. There is a reason why we have competition law. There's a reason why we have environmental regulations. You know, there is a reason why all of this legislation exists, and it's partly in recognition that, you know, you cannot trust corporations to act for the public good, that they will only act for the public good when they are forced to by regulation, you know, and that is precisely why environmental regulations exist, because, you know, if it is a balance between the environment and making money, yeah, we know what side they're going to go on.
And if they're public, they're obliged to do so. They're obliged to maximize shareholder value, and there's nothing there's nothing moral or immoral about it. It's just that's, I don't know, everyone works within the incentives and the rules that are faced. I think, I don't know, the other point just to add is that also ultimately copyright itself is a regulation. Copyright has not been sort of handed down from heaven. It is a government invented right. That, and it's not going anywhere, obviously.
No. And you know, that sort of public good and that sort of public imperative was a key part of copyright from the very beginning. It was about recognizing that, you know, if people cannot profit from what they create and their innovations and their inventions and their, you know, material, that will stifle innovation and invention and creation, and that is bad for society. So that kind of encouragement of you know, creation was part of what copyright was intended for. And, you know, the profit side of things was kind of a you know, a corollary of that. But the idea is that everybody benefits if you know, there is innovation happening in society. And so that public good was really at the kind of core of it. But I think it's gone too far towards kind of protecting profit now. And I think, you know, that there needs to be more recognition that, you know, copyright was intended to work for society. You know, the kind of private individual kind of benefit from it was a sort of side effect, but the core part of it originally was that, you know, we all benefit if innovation is happening in society, and that's what we want to encourage. But I think it's gone too far towards that kind of, I say, private individual profit, but actually increasingly the way copyright works, again going back into licensing and terms and conditions, is that actually it's just benefiting massive corporations now. And even on an individual level, people are actually not really effectively benefiting from their own creations, because when it comes to, you know, musicians and artists and writers, you know, a lot of them actually don't really make very much benefit and very much money from what they create, because the platforms and the dissemination is so controlled by these massive organizations that they then use that to, you know, force people to sign whatever terms and conditions they want. And that's exactly what's happening with digital content when it comes to libraries. You know, the means of distribution have been so kind of co-opted by, you know, massive corporations that they then can charge whatever they want. You know, it's the same issue with books as it is with music on Spotify to a certain extent. You know,
indeed, and these aren't even sort of copyright questions per se. It's more about then how do you treat people within a system, and you mentioned very strongly the role potentially of consumer and competition law, and of course the irony that, I don't know, libraries are places of collective consumption. I don't know, we have libraries in order to allow people to buy things through their taxes, through tuition fees, through whatever else, that allow them to buy things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get hold of. But in fact, they're not able to. They're facing these refusals to sell in that way. And Anna mentioned that this was sort of the biggest problem that they're facing in Finland. You mentioned sort of both disappearing works that are never there, but it's the irony that because the consumption is collective rather than individual, then consumer laws don't apply. And of course, libraries aren't businesses, so they can't go to the Competition and Markets Authority and say, well, this is harming my ability to do business, because after all, they're not they're not businesses. But I don't know, it feels like an area where there's lots of things going on with vertical integration, with potential gatekeeping behaviors, where you'd feel if competition authorities actually took a proper look, there'd be some quite juicy things going on. So I was going
to say, I mean, I think at the core of it, you know, I think various people have said, you know, if libraries didn't already exist, they wouldn't be allowed to exist in the kind of modern climate. You know, I think public libraries were kind of an innovation of a more publicly spirited time, I think. And, you know, if we were trying to set a public library system up from scratch in the current kind of economic and corporate environment, I don't think we'd be able to. I think public libraries particularly exist now because they've existed historically. But if we were trying to set it all up anew, it just wouldn't happen. It wouldn't be allowed. You know, massive corporations would use their weight to squash this kind of initiative before it even started. You know, the idea that people can go to a building and without paying for it, and the government's going to pay for it, you know, and that's one of the key sort of barriers that we're pushing against is yes, we're arguing for rights that already existed, but those rights, and to a certain extent, were granted to us in a very different kind of time and in a very different kind of climate. And so even though it doesn't seem radical, trying to push for an extension of that into digital, and in some ways, actually, it kind of is.
Well, it is. I suppose the counter argument would always be that I don't know, if any sort of economic logic was applied, we would not have designed copyright in the way that copyright is designed, as it makes no economic sense. I don't know, the duration and the extent of control that it allows has I don't know, you look at the Australian Productivity Commission report from a few years back, and they were saying that, I don't know, actually a 5-year term, that makes economic sense, not life plus 50. None of this.
Well, I always say, you know, my institution isn't going to carry on paying me after I'm dead. So why should copyright continue to sort of provide money after I've died? You know, I can benefit from it while I live because it's the work that I did. But, you know, why should my grandkids continue to profit from, you know, something that I created any more than, you know, the University of Derby is going to be paying my grandkids in 70 years?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure you won't be working or producing when you're dead anyway, so it's
No.
hardly an incentive. So I think we've got to the, so I can see actually one conversation in the chat, but what would you say to the argument that publisher needs profitable digital markets to make up for big losses in physical publishing in the last 20 years, and that many would go bankrupt without advantages in the digital sphere?
I mean, I think there's a kind of twofold argument to that. I think, you know, publishers have long been kind of making this kind of lost sale argument that you know, if stuff wasn't available for free, people would have gone and bought it, and therefore the free stuff is equivalent to a lost sale. You know, that was an argument that was being made a lot when it comes to like music piracy. You know, that if someone can go and download this track for free, they're therefore not going to go and pay for it, so we've lost money. But you know, people wouldn't necessarily have gone to buy it specifically. You know, I myself stumble across music that's available for free and then, you know, really like it and might go and buy the album. So actually, in some ways, it kind of incentivizes people to buy material. I think, you know, particularly when it comes to, you know, sort of digital or, you know, like academic texts, students would not have gone and bought those textbooks, you know, anyway. So that kind of lost sale argument, I think, is a bit of a fallacy, and it has been kind of deconstructed in the courts, thankfully. But I think also, you know, it kind of sort of skates over the fact that the sort of consolidation of the publishing industry has also harmed smaller publishers. And I have a lot of sympathy with smaller publishers. And in my experience, they're actually the ones that are most reasonable when it comes to prices and licensing terms. And they face challenges in terms of being sort of squashed out of the market by the massive companies. You know, with the Clarivate decision recently, for example, to sort of shut down ProQuest, that again harms small publishers, many of whom kind of used the ProQuest kind of platform to be able to get their content to libraries, because, you know, they didn't have the infrastructure and the you know, resources to be able to create their own platforms to sell to academic libraries or public libraries. So, you know, they paid fees to Clarivate, probably quite large fees, knowing Clarivate, and then, you know, they're kind of stuck when Clarivate decides to close down its ProQuest you know, platform. So I think, you know, this idea that you know, publishers are sort of en masse are the problem is partly, you know, it's partly, you know, our fault. We do try to lump them all together, but you know, a lot of what I'm talking about, you know, in the ebook SOS context is, you know, your massive conglomerates. It is, you know, your Elsevier's and your Taylor and Francis's and your, you know, your Penguin and, you know, your Hachette, your massive corporations that have hundreds of imprints below them, you know, and they are the problem. And they are a problem for libraries, but they are also a problem for other publishers as well. And I do have sympathy with those smaller publishers because, you know, from a library perspective, they are far more reasonable to deal with. You know, I think in many ways what we're facing in libraries is a symptom of something much, much bigger in the corporate world, you know, and it is that kind of consolidation, and it is these, you know, massive corporations that really do use their weight and their clout and their wealth to stifle you know, innovation and startups and smaller businesses, and they, you know, they wait until they get to a certain level of success and then they buy them up, and you know, that harms the marketplace for everyone, really. So in some ways, everything that we're talking about when it comes to ebooks is actually a symptom of a total failure of regulation on a, you know, really massive scale at those kind of high levels, because all this stuff that's happening downstream to a certain extent, I think, is a symptom of that.
Well, and as mentioned, it is the failure of those competition and consumer authorities to actually consider this as a field, because okay, maybe the market is smaller, but the downstream effects in terms of the impact on research, education, health are very significant. And even if it's not possible to put a euro, pound, dollar figure on it, that's not there. I think also just in thinking about the comment that was made, I don't know, I think publishing industry as a whole is doing pretty well. It doesn't, I don't know, it seems to be doing fine. I think, I don't know, there is obviously a concern about competition in the, I don't know, I think it gets called the attention economy at the moment, and the risk of losing more people to Netflix and losing more people to other platforms. But it's hardly, I don't know, attacking one of the key drivers of research output and of reading habits and of actually enjoying reading doesn't seem to be the smartest way of actually doesn't seem to be the smartest way of doing it. I don't know, it's like the polar explorers who eat their huskies. Okay, it'll fill you for a little bit, but it makes it far harder to actually reach your objective in the end if you end up having to carry everything yourself. So I realize, yeah,
And I mean,
we're running a little
academic
bit over, so
publishing,
yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, academic publishing is probably the single most profitable industry in the world. You know, the profit margins there are, you know, far in excess of Apple and Google and, you know, BP and
10 points north of Google.
yeah, I mean, that's enormous profit margins. So, you know, and we are talking about these kind of massive publishers that, you know, they are not struggling for money. And, you know, quite apart from anything else, no industry has a right to exist. No company has a right to exist. If their business model doesn't work for the market and the market pushes back against that, that is laissez-faire capitalist economics. You know, nobody has a right to continue to make profit or a right to continue to exist. And if your consumers start going, we've had enough, boo-hoo, I'm sorry, you should have adapted for the market. You didn't. Oh, well. You know, we hear all these headlines all the time about, oh, millennials are killing this industry, millennials are killing that industry. And I think, no, the industry just didn't adapt to the circumstances and did itself out of business. I'm not going to apologize for that.
No, and I think it's also that point to be made that it can be very easy, and often it gets presented that I don't know, the action of publishing, which obviously has a value in terms of taking knowledge, making sure it's properly formatted, organizing peer review processes and so on, actually making sure things are accessible, that has a value. But there are many ways of achieving that activity that may not involve business models that are potentially quite as harmful as some that are there now. But so I realize we've run over, and Anna's been kicked out of her hotel, unfortunately. But I just want to offer any final sort of quick words, and then I'll close up. No?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, that's cool. Okay, so so what I just want to finish up, and thank you to everyone who stayed with us. What we will do, I encourage you to look at, there's a few resources that certainly we've been working on within Knowledge Rights 21. I've already shared the link to the work about unlocking eBooks with CILIP. Those of you who joined earlier will have seen that Ben posted the link to the eBook pledge, which is a piece of work trying to actually define what good practice around ebooks could look like, and encouraging some voluntary sign-on to this by publishers. And this includes a set of model terms which are available and can be used. And obviously, we'd hope that people will sign on to it. I guess that to see if they actually do. There's also a report that we put out that's been authored by Centrum Cyfrowe and the Future Law Lab at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, looking at making the argument that actually, as one of the backstops available to libraries, it is legally defensible. There's a strong legal case for the ability of libraries to make digital copies of physical books and lend them out. We have, of course, the eBook position paper from Knowledge Rights 21. We'll include this in the note coming out of this. We're also looking forward to, in the coming months, putting out a study on competition in eBook markets and actually encouraging and getting people with that competition perspective, that competition knowledge, to actually look at what's going on. Is there anything that would look dubious otherwise? So with that, I want to say a big thank you to Caroline. Thank you for, as always, certainly for all the work that you're doing, for being such a model of how to sort of drive advocacy. And I think those examples, those tools, hopefully, as you said, can be taken up elsewhere. We can make sure that decision makers in all parts of the world are actually sort of listening into this and understanding that this is actually a big issue, that this is something that something should be done, and that they can actually do it. And thank you, Anna's had to go, but again, that model of libraries building their own, trying to take back some control, take back some power, but still facing that fact that ultimately they don't get the final say about what they're able to actually practice, what they're able to put into their collections, that they don't have that legal guarantee that they can access books on reasonable terms. We're not saying for free, but they can't access on reasonable terms, and the fundamental questions that continues to raise. So as Knowledge Rights 21, we will we can continue focusing on this, continue pushing for how do we make sure there are those guarantees, those fallbacks, those backstops, to make sure that there's a reason for all sides to stay at the table, to make sure we actually overcome those issues that Anna and Caroline have set out so clearly. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being with us. Thank you for staying with us a little bit over time. We will get the recording up as quickly as possible, but thanks.